Hello and welcome to this webinar with Octopus Deploy. And today we will be looking at how KinderSystems increase their deployment frequency by 2000% by using Octopus Deploy. We are here today, as you'll see, with Jorge Robledo, who is the VP of Operations over at KinderSystems, and then myself, Gemma Richards, who I am the Senior Events and Campaigns Manager here at Octopus Deploy, and I will be your host today. And with that, I will pass over to you, Jorge.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to share a little bit about our story, and so I guess the tagline here is that we increased our deployment frequency by 2,000%. That's a fairly significant leap from where we were, but let's take a dive in and tell you a little bit more about KinderSystems. So real quick, the agenda. A little bit of background, like I stated. I'm going to tell you about where we were, where we are now, how we got here, and then we'll have a little bit of room for Q&A. So let's move on. So about us, we're formerly known as Control Tech, founded in 1993. We did not start work in this industry until 1997. So we are the leading U.S. provider of subsidy management SaaS solutions, which means that hundreds of state agencies, Head Start programs, and childcare providers use our software. And we processed over 500 million attendance transactions. So if you go to a daycare facility that serves subsidy children, there is a strong chance that you may have encountered one of our products at some point. KinderSign or KinderSmart, and basically what happens is when you drop off your kid, you use our products to record that you have dropped off your kid or kids, and that same application gets used to process the out time. So when you pick them up, and that later turns into subsidy payments and calculations for those providers who are serving children who receive subsidy from the state. To that effect, we have calculated about $3 billion in subsidy payments as of a few months ago. So our mission, real quick, is to ensure that all players in the publicly funded childcare ecosystem have the software systems they need to deliver high-quality childcare to the families and children that they serve. So I'm a father of a almost 3-year-old son, and so the mission that we serve comes very close to my heart. I believe that what we do makes people's lives better. Right? Children are our next generation, and so makes it a little bit easier to get up and go to work day after day. So we do have a vast array of solutions. Just going to go over them really quick since that's not our primary focus today. But we essentially serve the entire life cycle of children through the subsidy space. So everything from attendance tracking, subsidy management and compliance for childcare centers, family fee billing, online enrollment, payment calculation and issuance, program integrity, so fraud detection related activities, resource and referral. How do I find a childcare facility that's got space and meets my requirements, and waitlist management, because as we all know, sometimes there are extensive waiting lists for childcare facilities, and so those facilities typically use some type of software like ours to manage those waiting lists. So where we were, I started at KinderSystems approximately 4 years ago, and back then, when I started out in IT, there was no automation. So what that meant was that while we had many applications to support and they were operational in multiple markets, every deployment, every upgrade to the application meant that we had to deploy that code by hand. A typical deployment window for our larger product lines could last anywhere from 3 weeks to more. So, for example, for a product that had 100 plus customers, the team, and back then the team doing the deployments was primarily the developers, believe it or not. The developers would have to essentially wait until after business hours and would tackle a few deployments each night, uh, basically doing everything manually. So the web application would get updated, the reports would get updated, the database would get updated, and any other components that were required, for example, .NET framework updates and such. Those were all manual deployments. And so with over 100 plus customers per product line, that process tended to be very painful. And frankly, it caused a lot of stress internally because you are eager to deploy new features for customers, but you have this huge bottleneck from a human resources perspective where even though the team could work long hours, the process was still very slow. And we all know that anytime that there's people performing repetitive steps, that increases the likelihood of mistakes. And so there was a big opportunity when I first came on board to make things better. And so that was kind of like one of our first big projects to bring in Octopus Deploy. Now, uh, a deployment for a product line that was not an emergency could take 3 weeks, but the painful scenario that occurred from time to time is if you had a critical hotfix, that basically meant that engineers were on the hook for however long it took to hotfix things. And so, that meant that sometimes you were in a place where people were working long hours or customers were suffering while they waited to get a hotfix. Because the developers were the resources assigned to do the deployments, that also meant that if you had a deployment going out the door, there was potentially coding that was not getting done, right? I mean, a person can only be in one place at the same time. So it became a bit of a challenge that needed to be resolved quickly to ensure that we could get back to doing what we wanted to do most, which is bring new features to market. Now, I will say that in terms of architecture, KinderSystems is not the most complex, but fairly complex. We deploy to on-prem data centers. We deploy to AWS, commercial and government, and we deploy to Azure, both commercial and government. And our systems interact with mainframes, basically new and old technology across the board. So that means that our solutions, while they are a SaaS offering for most, a lot of them have customizations that are very specific to our customers. So what might work in one environment may not be the way that you do deployments in a different environment. And so that is one particular area where Octopus provided us a lot of flexibility in terms of we were able to do both multi-tenant deployments and single tenant. In other words, we have environments that may have hundreds of customers, and then we have environments that only have one customer. Now, the development lifecycle for each product line is slightly different. We have done our best to keep those the same, but some environments have or rather some customers have requirements for additional environments for testing purposes. So for example, we may have a customer with 3 separate UAT environments if they are serving or working on multiple projects at the same time. We may have others with only one UAT, but an integration testing environment in a test environment, training environment, an environment with a copy of production data that may be a day old, and also, of course, the production and disaster recovery environment. So, Octopus Deploy afforded us the flexibility to really tailor our deployments to each product line. Very, very powerful product in terms of how things could be customized. So that's a little bit about where we were. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we are now. So as of today, we are a little over 100 plus employees. When I started, I believe we were around 60%. So we have seen some explosive growth. And that is, of course, a good thing, but it does not come without its own set of challenges. So as part of our Octopus Deploy implementation, we increased our deployment frequency. In other words, we've gone up about 2,000%, which is the tagline from the first slide. And our max number of deployments, meaning promoting code to production, peaked at about 482 separate deployments in a single week last year. So that's work that would have been otherwise impossible if we had not implemented Octopus Deploy as an organization. By the way, because our developers were able to focus on coding and not deployment, it meant that we were able to obtain or get to shorter release cycles. We basically are now able to deploy code just about any time that we want, and our sprints are about 2 to 3 weeks long, depending obviously on the content of those sprints. And we have moved a lot of the configuration into our files, into either files or the database. But the good news is that Octopus allows us to configure each environment to meet the customer needs, regardless of where that configuration might be set. Now, we have done extensive work to try to standardize our variable names and how we configure features and other options within the application. But the nature of our business, especially having acquired 2 companies over the past few years, is that not every product line will always align completely. And so that means that in terms of the CD, the continuous deployment tool that you select, it is vital that you pick something that will afford you the flexibility to do what you need to do. In a perfect scenario, everything would be standardized, but that's just not the reality that most of us live in. So next point, which is time savings. We are now able to perform 100 plus deployments in a matter of 2 hours or so. That includes everything from the backup process all the way through smoke testing, and 99% of our deployment process is now automated. So that means that we can pre-schedule deployments. For example, today we're going to do a deployment at 5:30 p.m. and that it's completely automated. And so what that means is that a person will check at the end of the deployment process that none of the failures, or that there were no failures, and if so, we'll manually intervene. But we are able to get notifications out of Octopus Deploy directly into Microsoft Teams. Now, there are other ways to drive notifications. We also use email notifications for successful deployments. But in terms of failures, our approach to that is that somebody should be notified as soon as that happens. Now, in 100 plus deployments at the same time, typically our error rate nowadays is about 0%. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I would urge you, if you are considering Octopus, or you are actively using Octopus, to not think about Octopus Deploy as a do it once and move on type of thing. Octopus is really a tool that's intended to be a part of continuous improvement. And our next point here is that Octopus Deploy lowered our cost to deploy code, right? So I touched briefly on how developers used to have to do all the deployments. So basically, uh, moving away from that, moving our deployment process into automation meant that we could then pass the torch, right? So our developers helped us design the deployment process, but now our IT team is able to do the deployments. So that means that help desk techs can do this and let engineers, developers focus on what they do best, which is troubleshoot complex issues, develop new features. And because there is this passing of the torch between teams, another big benefit of Octopus Deploy is shared knowledge. What that means is, before only a few technical folks really knew how the application worked. But because the knowledge is moved down to the front lines, to the help desk techs, that means that the knowledge is no longer something that is tribal in nature. In other words, it's properly documented and multiple people share it. So there is no longer that, well, we don't want to deploy this because the developer might be on vacation, right? Now there's enough foundational knowledge that you can mitigate a lot of the risk, but because there are many people that can jump in and troubleshoot. And so that provides peace of mind, and that also drives continuous improvement. In other words, we get ideas from a lot of the teams involved in Octopus, and it's not always the DevOps engineers. It's sometimes the developers. It's sometimes QA, and uh, it's sometimes our help desk techs, right? So uh, anyone and everyone is encouraged on our end to contribute. Now I will move on to the next slide, which is for continuous integration. I'll work through this diagram, but this is essentially a visual representation of our environment without getting into anything that might be considered intellectual property. So uh, at the root, we are primarily a Microsoft shop. Now, we do have a couple product lines that are heavy on Linux utilization. So while we started out as a Microsoft shop and we think of ourselves as a Microsoft shop, we really work in both Linux and Microsoft environments. So our source code gets checked into Azure DevOps, and that also means that our build servers are connected into Azure DevOps. So our recipes are in Azure DevOps, but we also, as part of our CI CD pipeline, we perform static code analysis. So if you are currently not doing this, I would strongly urge you to consider looking at tools that will allow you to scan your application for vulnerabilities. Some companies, depending on budgeting, may do external or internal audits once a year. But if you're constantly analyzing the builds in your pipeline, that means that you don't let that work pile up, right? So it becomes a little bit of second nature to kick off a major build and then go see what's in SonarQube or Snake. Now, just to explain there, we have two separate tools, right? SonarQube is an open source free tool. You can go download it. Yes, they do have a paid product, but the free version serves most companies. And Sneak or Snake, depending on who you ask, that is a paid buy tool. And the difference between those two tools, for me personally, is that Snake tends to have a little bit less noise on the line. So there's less false positives. And Snake also, in addition to doing static code analysis, has an open source licensing scanning component. In other words, because we are moving so quickly, it is possible that a developer may include a library that has a copyleft license. Now, if you're wondering what that is, let me explain that for you real quick. So if you go out and get a third-party component that's free of charge, at a glance, there may be a licensing requirement that requires you to publish the source code to your application if you're leveraging this component that has a copyleft licensing requirement. So in other words, for those of us that work in the private sector or get funding from public entities, that can be a major roadblock. In other words, the worst thing that can happen is you spend $1 million in R&D and then somebody realizes that you use their component and you're legally forced to share your source code. Now, that's not a concern for open source projects, but we are not an open source shop, right? We are selling a product, and so it is vital for our longevity that we ensure that any third-party libraries or components that we might add are properly vetted. And so Snake can stop a build from getting promoted further down the pipeline if there is a licensing issue, or you can throw an alert and notify the proper teams. Snake will also warn you when there are vulnerabilities in those third-party components. That is something that SonarQube does, but not as elegantly. So, again, it's really a layered approach to ensuring that we have some baseline considerations for security. So just real quick, moving on to the CD portion of this. So we obviously are doing deployments out of Octopus, but we do have an integration into Azure Active Directory. We are heavily invested into our security, and so any streamlining that we can do when it comes to identity and access management is a big win for us. Octopus Deploy allows us to integrate into Active Directory, which means that there's never a concern that we may accidentally leave an account on for an employee that's left the organization. So if you're not actively using this integration, this is another big one that we would encourage you to consider. And, I touched briefly on multi-tenancy. That is a really, really nice feature from Octopus Deploy as well. In other words, we can deploy to multiple customers in a single environment and have configuration that is different depending on who that customer is. So in our case, that tends to be 100+ customers in a single environment, all with different database connection strings, different underlying APIs in some cases, different secrets that get used for encryption and things of that nature. And another awesome feature from Octopus Deploy are variable sets. Variable sets allow you to create templates for variables that you can use, whether it may be cross products or across projects in Octopus. So for example, in our world, we have a Octopus project for the development branches, and we have an Octopus project for hot fixes. We have one for our main or master branch, depending on what your source code repository is using. And so what that means is we can have a developer add a variable in development, and by the time that release is hitting production, our engineers know that there is a missing variable that needs to be filled out prior to deployment. So that ensures that you cannot deploy code without adding a required field to the configuration, which is really big for us. Back in the day, it used to be that IT managed all the variables. But what we quickly realized is that Octopus works best in a team based culture. In other words, developers should be able to make changes to their variable sets without having to talk to IT. And another cool thing about the variable sets is that Octopus allows you to add a description, add an example, and so you can, if you're following best practices, add a new variable and give all the information that another teammate would need to fill out that variable without those two people having to talk to each other. And I don't know about you, but we are a completely remote company, so gone are the days of getting up from your chair and going and knocking on someone's door and asking them a question. Right now, while we do leverage Teams and other communication methods, a lot of this doesn't even really need to be a conversation as long as the example defined in the variable set is following best practices. So another very cool feature from Octopus that we are leveraging a lot this year, Dora Insights. So Dora allows us to have teams compare their output, right? Dora is one of the largest predictors of success and efficiency for development teams. And it doesn't just take development practices into account. It goes a step further. It takes a holistic view, a comprehensive view into how fast are you getting releases out there? How often are they failing? And how quickly can you recover from those? So for those that are perhaps larger companies like ourselves, being able to compare the development teams against each other to figure out what's working well, what is not, is really beneficial. There's not a need to reinvent the wheel, right? I think that oftentimes folks in our position tend to be very interested in looking at the shiny new technology, but we often forget that for technology to be successful, there needs to be strong processes in place. And so, to that effect, Dora metrics allows you to basically keep an eye on the outcome, which is at the end of the day, the most tangible way of measuring performance, right? Are you releasing features fast enough? Are there a lot of mistakes? And keep in mind, the nature of software development implies that there will always be defects. So the question is not necessarily how many, but how quickly do you recover from those? And so this last piece over here, I touched on a little bit earlier, which is Octopus Deploy allows us to be very flexible in our deployment. So we deploy to AWS, to Azure, to government and commercial environments. And, that's a bit of a nuance because while high level commercial and government cloud environments are the same, there's always little differences on the back end. For example, the endpoints for cloud native services tend to be different because they're routed to different data centers. So Octopus allows us to not really have to worry about that a whole lot. And just real quick, not on this slide, but we are doing a deep dive into containers and Kubernetes, and that is one area where Octopus also shines. There is a lot of changes into architecture coming up, and Octopus allows us to abstract that away and have us focus on, again, coding features and not having to worry about the nuances of deploying Kubernetes to the various environments. So what's interesting in terms of Dora metrics is that, again, you're comparing practices between teams, right? So we identified that there were some changes in one of our teams that were happening very late in the software development life cycle. So things that we would typically expect to see break in development were breaking in a near production environment. And Octopus allowed us to see that due to the failure rate that was taking place in pre-production environments. We were able to identify that this particular team was waiting to make some changes or specifically change configuration items in near production environments. The challenge that presents is we typically schedule a release to go out on a specific day, and we do a test in production-like data a day before. Well, if you're encountering issues that require you to manipulate the deployment process, that translates into delayed delayed deployments, delayed release of new features, bug fixes. And so by identifying that, we were able to shift that process left and ensure that those changes are taking place in an environment, a lower environment like QA or even unit tests and development. So I'm going to move on to my next slide here, which is, how we got here. And this is really intended to be some things to keep in mind if you're new to Octopus, and how do you make sure that there's success for your organization, right? So the first thing that we did is we met with all the department heads that had something to do in the deployment process. So that meant IT, that meant the developers, so the app developers, the database developers, and the report developers, as well as QA. And we basically asked, what is the most painful part out of deployments for you? And everybody had a slightly different answer, but in essence, everything came down to a lot of repetitive work. So each department, even though there was a subset of teammates that were deploying code to production, every department was performing manual steps in development and QA environments over and over when they were testing. And so by identifying pain points, we were able to eloquently produce a list of priorities in terms of automation. And we then translated that into time saved, which allowed us to, which is my next point, get top-down buy-in. In other words, everyone from the CEO all the way down to the help desk reps understood that while implementing Octopus would take away some of their time from their day jobs, the trade-off, the payoff was significant and would basically translate into more time for them to perform their daily jobs. So that was a pretty big win. And we also took the time to document manual processes. So this is how it works today when somebody does it manually. And that allowed us to identify opportunities for process improvement prior to automation. So I'll give you an example. Part of what we did in automating our database deployments is that we created an in-house tool that could go into our source code repository and identify the starting version of the database and the target version and grab every script in between. Now, there are many, many ways of doing this. Octopus Deploy has good documentation on a couple different methods on how to get there, but the approach that we took, because of how we organize our database changes and our naming convention, we had a good baseline to quickly automate. If we could build a tool that could essentially grab all these scripts, sometimes more than 20, merge them into a single file, and then execute that file. So we also started weekly check-ins with the various teams affected during the initial implementation. This is what we're working on. It got to be a lot of show and tell. Does this work the way that you want it to? Anything that we're missing? Are there any conditions or edge case scenarios that need to be thought about when you're thinking about the variable sets? Because just real quick, one area when it comes to variable sets that's important is you can have variable sets that set variable at the project level, or you can have a variable set that sets it at the tenant level. Well, if you have an application that has common secrets between all the customers, you would want that variable to be at the project level so that you don't have to configure it every time you're deploying a new customer. So those weekly check-ins allowed us to figure out where the best place was for a lot of these data elements in our configurations. And we made a commitment to continuous improvement, and that's really big because you're never really done in the world of DevOps, right? Automation may work today, but you may add a new API, add a new product, or deploy code differently depending on business needs. So we keep a log of all our ideas, regardless of who they come from, and then we prioritize those based on impact to, it could be time or deployment, efficiency. So for example, if you're able to deploy to multiple customers at the same time, that usually has a tangible effect on those folks that need to check out the system at the end of the day, right? So the faster that a deployment can take place, the sooner everybody can go home. We also made a commitment to automate everything. So initially we started with the applications. Now we're moving to uh, the automation of our interfaces. So our data exchange with our customers, that is something that we're working on automating today. And it goes back to reducing risk, right? If you need one engineer to be online because he's the one who coded it, he's the one that knows how to deploy it best, well, that's a risk to your organization. That's a risk to your customers. So the more automated and the more time that you have to bake in that automation, the less risk that you have. And the last thing is that you should leverage as many Octopus features as possible. We talked a little bit about DORA metrics, but go look at those release notes so that when you're upgrading to a different version of Octopus, if you're on-prem, so that you know what's coming and you have an opportunity to think about new ways to solve problems, because what may work well today may have a more efficient way of doing it in the future. So that is basically the presentation in a nutshell, but I'd like to open it up for any questions that anybody might have.
Cool. I think we had a couple here. So let me just highlight these and bring them up on stage. So the first one is, what do you use for your continuous integration?
Sure. So, we covered this a little bit further back, but we basically use Azure DevOps, and that is what integrates directly into Octopus Deploy now. Octopus integrates with many other solutions, so you don't have to be a Microsoft shop to use Octopus Deploy. Octopus has come a long way. Initially, it was a .NET deployment tool primarily, but now it's absolutely friendly and compatible with Linux deployments.
Cool. And then the last question here, also from Ioana, is there any interesting best practice that DORA metrics helped you to identify?
Absolutely. It helped us identify when one of our teams was waiting a little too long to test changes in the deployment pipeline. So in other words, they were testing changes near production, and that typically meant that by the time they were testing something, we already had a production go live date, which meant that any failures could potentially push back the deployment. So by being able to identify the failures at various stages in the software development lifecycle, we could see that there was essentially an outlier in the number of failures, and quickly allowed us to identify the why.
Nice. Cool. Last call for any last questions. And if there are none, then we will end the webinar here. You'll receive a copy of the webinar in your inbox, hopefully tomorrow. And then, Jorge, are you able to share the slides as well? There was a couple of comments in the chat asking for that.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. We can share those out, and we'll say that it looks like we have one last question, if you don't mind if we answer that.
Yeah, sure. Let me bring that up. So have you identified any gaps in the functionality for the multi-tenant features that Octopus offers?
We have not. Every time that we thought there was a gap, it was really because we didn't fully understand the best way of implementing a particular feature. There are, as of today, after 4 years into this adventure, there are no gaps in terms of the multi-tenant features that we have identified. We We do some level of feature flagging, and that's typically based on a switch that is on a application configuration file, and that is really easy to handle in Octopus. Basically, we default to off in our configuration files, and then we can have Octopus toggle that to true or yes, depending on the feature, or even drop in configuration attributes such as endpoints or secrets. So definitely you can do feature flagging, and I would recommend to handle that at the tenant variable level, again, using variable sets.
Perfect. And then I think that kind of answers Santiago's question too, because he had asked, do you do feature flagging with Octopus? And if so, how?
Yes. Yeah, that's basically the same answer. We default them to no, and we flip that depending on the tenant configuration.
Perfect. I think those are all of the questions. So we will close down the webinar here. Thanks everyone for your time. Thank you, Jorge, for joining us on this webinar. And if you have any questions, please let us know. There'll be details on how to do that on the follow-up email. And we hope to see you again next time.